I'm going to be talking today about bias, and it's if you look at the representation here, I represent a company called Latimer, which is a large language model trained with diverse data using inclusive black and brown narratives. We're trained on a variety of different data from documents like textbooks, dissertations, 100 years of newspapers, etc. And the founder is a friend of mine who's supposed to be here but couldn't. His name's John Passmore, and I'm helping him build the technology here. I want to start with a little bit of a story here. In the 90s, the UK Post Office commissioned a software platform for its postmasters, who were largely small, medium businesses and retailers. And the software was built by a third-party company and deployed within a few years. As soon as it was deployed, within 2 days, they started to realize that there was a significant discrepancy between the numbers that were coming from the system and the actual dollars that were coming through. And the post office and the company that built it responded by charging and filing a lawsuit against its own postmasters. 1,000 of them were convicted. About half of them ended up settling, and 4 or 5 suicides. So it didn't end well. 20 years later, that issue is coming up significantly. I bring that, and at the time, both the post office and the software company knew exactly all the bugs that existed in the system, but they denied it in court. And of course, the fallout of that is now you can read it in the news. They're settling. The reason I bring up that story is because that's exactly what's happening with LLMs today. People are, we're using the planet and humanity as a test bed, and going at such a pace that we're forgetting that a lot of the systems that are there today in terms of guardrails, et cetera, are being built after the fact, after the product has been released. So when you talk about bias, how bias creeps into AI, it's rooted in data. A lot of it is based on data. That's mainstream data. 70% of it is based on people like us here, and it does not represent the larger population. It's pre-trained, so very hard to change later on. And there's different types of bias. There's bias of the data. Then there's bias that creeps in the way that the data is stored and labeled. And then there's in the algorithmic bias that comes up when that the system itself generates based on pattern recognition, because it's being built, it's been programmed for success on any task that has been given. And you can see that bias is has significant interest here. And the impact on business is quite significant in that there's many studies that prove that McKinsey released a report a few months ago which showed that eroding trust and brand image has a significant bottom line and top line impact on companies. Regulatory and financial risk. It has significant issues in terms of operational risk and the areas that you operate in with your workforce. So, I talked a little bit about this, how bias is manifested. One of the things we're doing at Latimer, in addition to having created a large language model that just works with less bias, is we're building a system that allows companies to be able to run any text or any of their outputs of large language models or any models through Latimer to be able to determine and measure bias. Because if you can't measure something, you can improve it. So we're doing exactly that, and I'll get into that a little bit. And the challenge with measuring bias and detecting and measuring bias is because of the stochastic nature of LLMs, the fact that it's pre-trained, and a lot of the definition of bias is so contextual and relative to each of us, right? Our own upbringing, how we perceive certain things, and our knowledge of the information that is being put out. And it's time consuming. If you look at 3 different responses from LLMs, each of them could be construed as bias for different people. So we developed a comprehensive bias mitigation framework, which we call, and a formula that we came up with called bias coefficient. And there's 3 steps to this: identification of the bias, measurement, and then how do you intervene and take corrective action. So checking and corrective action of bias is critical. And there's multiple areas that we take into account, like sentiment bias, representation bias, impact bias, the data bias, and we've got corrections for each of those parameters. I talked a little bit about this in terms of the data sources that we have. So the first thing we have to do is make sure that the data is more inclusive. And we use existing LLMs, but we add additional data on top of that using a RAG model. And this is the architecture that we use. And I want to point out that for each of these here, at every point, you have opportunity to influence bias. From the time that you store documents, the way you label them, the way you retrieve them, the way you do semantic search, and then all the way down to the prompting, and then adding additional prompt, fine-tuning, and then being able to retrieve that and then put that in a contextual way. So every element of that you can either introduce bias or minimize bias. This is the BIQ coefficient we came up with, and I won't get into that. Happy to discuss that later on. But the most important thing I want to point out here is how Latimer behaves compared to other language models. You'll see here the red is the Latimer responses. So when you have questions, we ran hundreds of prompts through this. When you have questions about gender, you'll see that the difference is Latimer responds with more contextuality because it has more contextual data. And as in more relevant areas like race and social class, it's especially more nuance around its response. And on other factors, which are more common, LGBTQ family, where Latimer does not have specific data, it is more, it's more balanced. There's much to be done, so I'll leave you with those thoughts. Recognizing and addressing AI bias is critical, and we hope to build a standardized tool that's able to measure and be able to correct bias. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.